and this last session is on the Portuguese infrastructures, and we have 3 areas, so Cryo-EM, MS, and NMR. So we'll start with the first one, which is the recent Cryo-EM PT. So the new Cryo-EM TEB network in Portugal for life science and health science, and this will be presented by Paulo Ferreira from INL in Braga. So Paulo, thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, in particular Professor Maria Armenian. So today I'm going to talk about the Cryo-EM PT. This is the new Cryo-TM network in Portugal for life and health sciences. I'm heading the Center for Advanced Electron Microscopy, Imaging and Spectroscopy at the International Iberian Technology Laboratory, so you can contact me there, and also at IST, I'm a professor there of material science. So I'm actually coordinator. As I said, my background is in microscopy and material science. Don't be scared, because there are actually many biologists in the network, so you're not alone here. So just before I actually start talking about the network, just give you a brief context. As you probably know, within the Portuguese system, we have this national roadmap of infrastructures, and that's where the network is actually placed. So we submitted a proposal, this was 2019, it was accepted, and now it's part of this national roadmap. The mission is as follows: provide access to state-of-the-art mid-range cryo-electron microscope, enabling industrial and academic users to meet the demands of regulatory agencies in the EU and the US, and of course to carry cutting-edge research in health and life sciences. And the goals of the network are the following. First of all, to enable a jump in health and life research, in particular the areas of biochemistry, cell biology, bioengineering, structural biology, pharmacology, and chemical engineering. Then, of course, and very important, to provide technical and scientific support to Portuguese companies in the health sciences area. And then, regarding the training, of course, the goal is to train master's and PhD students as well as postdocs in the areas of life sciences and bioengineering, and of course, trying to recruit PIs related with cryo to Portugal. Then to strengthen the competitiveness of Portuguese researchers in applications for European industrial funding. As you will see, the machine that we are proposing will actually allow research then to be subsequently done in Europe. And then lastly, to promote the creation and maturity of startups through the advanced instrumentation and specialized technicians. So, if you look at the Cryo-EM network, this is actually has been very interesting, because it involves pretty much most of the institutions related with biology in Portugal. You will see later on, the central node will be at INL, which is located in Braga. But then we have the participation on several other nodes. So you have I3S in Porto, University of Coimbra, ITQB in Lisbon, the Gulbenkian Institute in Lisbon as well, UBI, which is in Covilhã, and then the IMN Institute in Lisbon, University of Évora, and then the CCMAR at the University of Algarve, University of Minho, IST in Lisbon, and UCIBio Nova at the University of Nova in Lisbon. So you see, it's actually spread out throughout the country, and this is actually was a very nice teamwork that allowed this to happen. So if you look at then the overall picture, as I mentioned, this will be the center node, and the reason, of course, the machine will be sitting there, and then we will have these distributed nodes where actually most of the biology work will be done. INL, there is also a couple of groups, but most of the researchers are, of course, located elsewhere. So the first question you might ask, why was INL chosen as a center node? First of all, if you are not familiar with INL, this is actually an international organization. The legal status, this is not Portuguese or European, it's actually international. There are about 400 people working there, of which 180 PhDs from about 40 nationalities. There is a really nice 1,000 square meter clean room and an advanced electron microscopy center. And this was the reason, or part of the reason why it was chosen. I will give you a couple more reasons why INL was chosen as a center node. And actually, one of the first ones is actually an outstanding infrastructure. So this is actually what is called the IQ accuracy corridor. This is sitting in floor -2 of the building. This is protected from vibrations, electromagnetic fields. This is of course important for high-end electron microscopes. You will see that there is a corridor here, and then as you go from door to door, the microscopes are actually sitting there. Typically you will see like a pre-chamber here where the operators are working, and then the machine is inside here. So for example, in this case we have copper doors and some electromagnetic shielding to prevent the machine to interact with the computers and so on, particularly if you are interested in high resolutions. So this was a reason. This was built from scratch. If you try to refurbish a typical room elsewhere, you're talking about 3 to 5 million of refurbishing price. So that was one of the reasons this was chosen. The second reason is because there is already a very nice microscopy infrastructure. This is actually the best center in Portugal at the moment, and one of the best too in the Iberian Peninsula. We have the very high-end machines with sub-angstrom resolution. This is a double-corrected machine with TEM and STEM capability, so you can achieve about 0.6 angstrom resolution in this machine. The second one, which is probe-corrected, where you can do STEM with aberration correction as well. So this is two high-end machines. Then we have a transmission TEM-STEM microscope, a bit more conventional, but nevertheless still very important. And then a FIB system, FIB-SEM, a focus ion beam, and then an environmental SEM. So these are all, and actually the machines we are getting will be something in between. So in terms of capability and sophistication of this instrumentation, I think we have already pretty good experience. On top of that, we have, of course, facility managers with high expertise. These are three Alex Oliver. Alex is responsible for the TEM-STEM, the two high-end machines. Alex is a surface scientist responsible for the XPS and the FIB. And then Oliver, which is a biologist by training in electron microscopy. So he will be actually in charge of the cryo-TEM that is coming. And we are about to hire, so we are in the process of interviewing now and hiring another person which is also going to assist Oliver in this endeavor. So, with respect to the distributed nodes, of course, this is where the users are coming from, typically working on structural biology, cellular biology, and biochemistry. There are, of course, others. And the idea is you will have sample preparation equipment within the distributed nodes. There's a couple of bots here. And then you have terminals sitting in the nodes which access the mainframe, which is at INL. Of course, you can go to INL, do the work there, but for the sake of particular processing data, you will sit in your terminal and you can do the work. I will show you in a moment. You can do the work of the process your data after you are there in the microscope. So, with respect now to the instrument, so being part of the national roadmap, then when a call was open, the network actually proposed an instrument. And this was a really nice teamwork, pretty much by all the institutions that you just saw there. It was really very nice. We worked together and we were successful in getting 2.4 million euros. This was the budget approved, of which 2 points or about 2 million so provided by FEDER. The rest, of course, was provided by INL and the remainder of the partners. So together we were able to compose the other 15%. And so the question next, once you have 2.4 million euros, is what instrument to buy. And so what we did was we did a kind of a questionnaire trying to understand the research in health and life sciences in Portugal, and this is what we found. Interest in small molecules, proteins, microorganisms, viruses and bacteria, eukaryotic cells and tissues. And of course, within that is a few examples, like developing new medicines that release. Here, interest in proteins involving the invasion and growth of tumors, and also diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson. Some interest in flu virus, cellular structures connected to cancer, microcephaly and obesity, and then the muscle tissue and cellular migration. So that was the first kind of understanding, and then the second was what kind of techniques could we use to actually tackle those problems. And again, the questionnaire showed that there was a large interest on cryotomography and single particle analysis, also quite a bit on cryostem tomography, plastic electron tomography, and plastic stem tomography. Based on the funding we had and this interest, we decided to go on a dedicated cryo machine. So cryo-electron tomography and single particle analysis can be done. These now we need a stem detector. There was no funds available to purchase, but of course it's possible to adapt the stem detector in the future, which will allow a few more techniques to be able to be performed. So on this basis, we decided on a Glacius 200 kV machine. This is kind of the mid-range or high resolution. You have the 300 kV, which is much more expensive. So in this way, you can actually do most of the work here, and if you have really high resolution needed, you can go to a center in Europe after you look at your samples, and you go to the 300 kV. In principle, the installation is predicted to be around September, something like that. As I said, the 200 kV machine with a 12-grid autoloader. This is a typical column with we'll have 4 condenser lenses in the gun, 2 condenser lenses, objective lenses, diffraction lenses, and then intermediate lenses and 2 projecting lenses. So that's a typical column. But then associated with that, we have a direct detector camera and the SETA D camera. The SETA D, this is a CMOS camera, which can get about 18 frames per second. This is connected with a micro LED package, so you can do electron diffraction. And you need that SETA D camera. This allows you to actually use lower doses, which are critical for this kind of work. Then, of course, we have the direct electron camera. This can take 250 frames per second. This is a very good instrument, and this what is called this detection quantity efficiency. They are really good for both cameras. And then at the end of the day, what you can do is you do single phase reconstruction, cryotomography, and micromeeting. So the flow will be, you have sample preparation, you can do it your node, bring the samples to INL, or you can be at INL, do some preparation, go to the instrument, and then you can INL do processing if you want, or you can go back and do the processing from your own institution. So we have already identified the room, INL. It's actually along that corridor that I just mentioned before. This is next to the XRD room. Here you will have independent air condition. Again, you have this operator room, so you will be controlling the machine from here, and then this will be the electron microscope room. And so then there is a technical corridor. In the back side of that corridor that I show you, all the chillers and UPS instruments, everything is on the back to avoid any kind of vibrations as well. So this is a technical corridor. When the people come and need to fix things, they don't even enter the room. Everything is scheduled for that. Here's a bit more detail. This is inside the room. You have basically the microscope with the tank, the nitrogen vessel, and then there's a small table here to put some samples or something. I will show you actually the next, I believe it's an installation that happened in Austria. The movie is running a bit slow, but at least you can see a little bit of what the machine looks like. With respect to the room, if you could roll the movie, please.
E o resto não corre. Não corre. É tal história, não corre.
We just tried just before, 10 minutes ago. So that's a Murphy's Law normally.
Agora se ele arranca palmo a seguir.
I don't know, maybe.
Não. Vemos? Está arrancado. Agora arrancou.
As I said, the movie is a bit, I don't know, it's jumping for some reason. This is parked. Now let me, okay, this is still running.
Mas eu reinicio.
It's very low. Let me move to the next. This is the kind of after a few days of installation. And you can see the column, and then of course nowadays they are all protected just to prevent a bit more vibrations and also electromagnetic field shielding. So this is how the machine will look like, just putting the last panels. These rooms are, in terms of air condition and acoustic insulation, so it's important just to make sure we get the resolutions needed. Okay, I guess that's about it. Okay, so in addition to that, of course, we have some support equipment. You have a cryo ultramicrotome. This is already CT-INL. There are some plunge freezers, and with the proposal we got actually a redundancy on those. We get a few machines of this type, and for those, if you feel like your proteins are not just right after you travel, you can do last step of protein purification before you go into the instrument. In addition to that, as I mentioned, the IT capability is very important. So we have the microscope, then you have this EPU software, which basically involves the user interface with the graphic card. We have most of the workflow, particularly for single particle analysis. So you collect most of the images here, and then you go to the workstation. So here you do the processing. This is an INL, but in addition to that, we have three other workstations with 400 terabytes of storage, of which 120 terabytes of fast processing storage. So you can work at INL, or if you are at one of these nodes, whatever node, you can access these workstations. The data will be there for 3 or 4 months while you process. At the end, when you're done, we just delete the data because we need the data to be transferred from the one session. This is on the order of terabytes every time the session ends. So, at the end of the day, you can do, of course, research from macromolecular complexes to cells. Here is a case of single-phase reconstruction, single-particle reconstruction. This was actually something that was done in 2013, and much more. And now this is something else we can do quite high resolution. Of course, as I mentioned, you can go to a 300 kV machine if you need to. You can do cryotomography, of course. This is the case, and as I mentioned, we got the sanity camera with the micro ED. So you can, in case you're working with crystal instructors, you can get near the reciprocal space, the diffraction pattern. You can mask the transmitted beam and then index the spots so you can recognize the crystal structure, whatever you are looking at. Of course, this can be done very locally from point to point. Can be very well, and then the camera, as I said, you can go to relatively low doses, which are critical for this kind of work. Okay, so just to again mention that this was the users, the list of users that showed us an interest in this capability, and you see pretty much most of the academic institutions in Portugal, plus a few Spanish. There's actually interest quite a bit from Galicia, and others as well, here one from Madrid. And we have also pharmaceutical companies, R&D services, and nanobiotech companies. And here I should emphasize that Blue Pharma and Immunotherapy, they've been actually closely working with us from the beginning and very interested in this network as well. And you see others as well. So I believe this will be important for these companies as well. So what we feel this is going to be the impact of such a structure. Of course, help developing new therapies for cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, COVID of course, and other bacteria which are currently resistant to antibiotics. Allow companies to comply with mandatory regulatory requirements, promote research to be competitive in calls. This is very important, that you can get enough data so that to be competitive in these calls. Of course, attract young and established outstanding researchers, create new products and new jobs, and of course, within the context of this meeting, this is very important, interact with the Instruct. Of course, these are critical with this kind of capabilities. My last slide is just to show you that, so far I show you the first phase. The second phase is now from 22 to 27. We already submitted an expression of interest, and the idea when the call opens is to, of course, get additional human resources for the central and other nodes, additional IT equipment for the center and other nodes, but I would say this will be more centered on the other nodes, and sample preparation for nodes as well. And then lastly, we would like to get the cryofilm for lamella preparation for cryotomography. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So we'll have our time for discussion. So we'll move on to the next infrastructure. So this time we'll have magnetic resonance mass spectrometry for structural biology, and it is my pleasure to announce Carlos Cordeiro.
Thank you, Silvia. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A pleasure to be here again. So I'll be talking about magnetic resonance mass spectrometry. So definitely, when we look at structural biology, we are actually experiencing a revolution. We are living very exciting periods. If you look at the portfolio from Instruct, of course you have sample preparation first, biomolecular analysis afterwards, and then physiological sequence, and you go to determine your coordinates. Doesn't matter if you use magnetic resonance techniques, electron microscopy, or classic X-ray diffraction. And this revolution started with the introduction of quartz electron. For the first time, the ability to accurately predict not only structures, but what follows next is structures, complexes, and ligand binding. All from machine learning or artificial intelligence, if you like to say. So these changes are very. Before you go to your structural determination, you can already do a lot of validation of what was predicted. And in many cases, it may happen that you don't need to go directly to structural analysis. So this will alleviate a lot of pressure on critical technologies. What will happen in the future, I cannot tell, but this is something that is very likely to happen. AlphaFold is not perfect, but it's far superior to anything else. And what comes next will certainly be far superior to all that. Imagine that you are working with something and you have a prediction that this is a tetramer. And then you determine, using, for example, mass spectrometry, and you determine that it's actually a dimer. So clearly there was something wrong in the model. But if you determine it's a tetramer, if you determine the binding surfaces, most likely you really don't need to go all the way down to the structure, because you already have validation. So magnetic resonance techniques are key for structural analysis. Of course, they both deal with fundamental properties of matter and the way matter behaves into high magnetic fields. For NMR, we are talking about spin. For mass spectrometry, we are talking about M, that is mass, or if you like, mass over charge. They are both characterized by the fact they are of extreme resolving power. This is because these machines measure frequency, and frequency is the physical property that we can measure more accurately, including time. But we know time is not linear, so let's not worry too much about it. The other advantage of these techniques, of course, is that you can probe the dynamics of structures. We have several techniques that you can do it. Of course, the one on the left, this is the 1.2 gigahertz. I think it was the first one to be installed in Italy. And of course, it requires a very specialized installation. But this one, of course, can determine atomic coordinates. This one cannot determine directly. But of course, it also requires a very special installation. You cannot put this just in any room. I think I could install at least 2 or 3 in this room, but maybe later. So, mass spectrometry is actually a structural technique because we can determine a lot. We can weigh molecules and we can immediately tell the stoichiometry But we can use ion mobility techniques, and then we can determine collision cross-section. And in some cases, if you do this in an oriented way, perhaps you can get to something that is non-sax, but very similar to it, because you are again transforming something that is unidimensional into a three-dimensional shape. You can determine dissociation constants. For example, imagine that you are trying drugs. You can determine the molecular constants, and this is quite important. You cannot determine this with classical structural techniques. You can do surface mapping. You can immediately tell what are the points of contact, what is interacting, what is not interacting. You can even measure the distances by using cross-linking agents. Although these techniques are not easy, they can provide a rough map of atomic positions. And then, of course, you also have hydrogen deuterium exchange that you can also do by magnetic resonance, and this will give you a lot of information considering dynamics, structural dynamics, but also surface exposure and what happens, for example, when a protein unfolds, binds something, or spectralizing the reaction, something like that. So this gives you access not to static structures, but actually to experimental data on time-resolved situations. And then, of course, you have a very powerful tool, and this is when we start breaking things. For example, if I throw this pointer against the wall, which I'm not going to do, although I did break the pointer exactly like this one, just in case, I will have fragments. And from the fragments, I can probably reassemble the shape I had in my hand. But this goes much farther. You have a lot of possibilities. Most mass spectrometers can only do CIB or maybe ETD. Only magnetic resonance and mass spectrometers can do all of this. They can do all of this sequentially and in combination. So this means that you can break a molecule, have a fragment, break it again with another technique, and you get different information. What we are trying to explore now is something that is called electron capture dissociation. So basically, you radiate your protein molecules with a stream of electrons. So this will completely interfere with the electronic distribution of the molecule, and those proteins behave as semiconductors. So what you will have is a breakage of the vector bond. But the interesting part is that this will preserve non-covalent connections. So anything that is connected to the protein will protect the amino acid residues that are beneath it. So we can actually determine where exactly this thing is binding on the structure. And of course, it has been found through the years that ECD is actually sensitive to structure. For example, alpha helices tend to produce more fragments than beta sheet. So most likely combining this with machine learning, we can probably infer a lot of information if we do this on a protein that is on its native state. So this is a work in progress, but it's a way to go. ECD is not a recent method. I mean, it was discovered in the 90s. But it is, I would say, intriguing up to today because of this characteristic. It's possibly the most effective method to actually break the structure of a protein, and it's the method that enables top-down analysis of protein structure. Of course, to analyze proteins, we have to make it fly. We have to take it from solution, put it in the gas phase, and this is where the magic happens. Of course, if you do native, this is a comparison of mass spectra from a tetrametric protein around 150 kilodaltons. For magnetic resonance mass spectrometers, I would say this is the sweet spot where you can actually have isotopically resolved molecules. It can go up to about 1 million. For native mass spectrometry, people tend to use other instruments, modified orbitrams, for example, and especially modified Q-tops. Modified Q-tops don't have a high limit. You can analyze things with 8, 9 million daltons, like intact viral particles with or without genetic material. But they don't provide a resolution. Why do you need this kind of resolution? Because if you have isotopic resolution, of course you can see things like very small mass changes. Not just the binding of a small molecule of a substrate that is around 100 daltons, but you can also see things that are related, for example, with hydrogen deuterium exchange. Incidentally, electron capture dissociation also prevents the scrambling that happens whenever you do the breakage of a protein structure with other methods. So this shows on the same instrument, on the same tuning conditions, that different sources produce vastly different results. For example, the two ones are the commercial ion sources, and as you can see, they're more or less useless. Best results are done with this kind of tips that are homemade, using a pipette puller, and then they are covered with gold. This is pretty much standard, but we can get tips. The smaller the inner diameter, the better the ionization conditions. So we can go down maybe to 0.5, 0.25. The ones we use more regularly have about 1 micron internal diameter on the tip. These are the ones that produce the best results. But of course, they work with homemade ion sources. And this is not high throughput. It can take a lot of time and it requires a lot of skill, not only to do this, but also to actually use it in the correct way. So we try to use automated methods. So this is basically an auto-sampler that uses a special chip. So this technology has been used for automation, but the interesting part is that it provides very good spectra, and this can be improved. So what you have is a chip which contains 400 spots, which means that, say, if a mass spectrum takes about half an hour to collect, you can do about half an hour plus 400, so that would be about 200 hours, roughly 10 days, and you can cover these samples. Why is this important? Because you can do screening, drug binding screening, fragment screening, and so on. And this is very sensitive. If we have isotopic resolution, even a small molecule that binds here will produce a very tiny little peak that you can immediately correlate to binding, and you can tell how many molecules have binding to that. And sometimes it may be difficult. When you do X-ray or cryo-EM, there is always this thing, we found this extra density. Maybe you can resolve the extra density, or maybe not, there's just a lot of density. In this case, you can tell whether this density is at a specific position by fragmenting and telling what is going on. Why you need resolution? Because even a small protein around 90K, it will produce a lot of fragments. All these fragments, as topically resolved, can go up to thousands of species. A machine like this can resolve something like tens of thousands without too much effort. I think the largest number of isotopically resolved molecular formulas was something like 300,000. And this was done at a relatively moderate field. This was analysis of crude oil, something that came out of a well, and it was analyzed and 300 molecular formulas were found. So this is the type of resolution that we are talking. What we do with the resolution is up to us, but it's good to have. So in this case, of course, we can fragment this protein just to pinpoint where a specific post-translational modification is found. So in this part here that seems harmless, you cannot see anything. Actually, if you enhance this, you start seeing a lot of peaks, and all these peaks are the isotopic distribution of fragments. And you can isolate again, and you can see that this is pure, and again, isotopically resolved. And when you fragment, you get the characteristic sequence fragments from which you can tell that something is wrong. And this something that is wrong has an increase of mass. And this increase of mass is related to a specific post-translational modification. Again, in many occasions, post-translational modifications are strange densities around some atoms. And this can tell you exactly what is there. Of course, we can work with larger proteins, in this case, with the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2. And we can discriminate between, of course, the triangular and the single form. So this is the basis of an assay where we can actually study the assembly, disassembly, and we can actually test if we can produce more of this form, which of course would be good to inactivate the virus. But one thing that you can see is that if you are dealing with this, you have resolution, isotopically resolve everything. In this case, you don't even resolve the charge states. I mean, you can see that the charge states are trying to emerge, but you cannot isotopically resolve. This is not because this is a large protein. It's because it's highly heterogeneous, so we still need to work ways to get more and more resolution. And that means magnetic resonance mass spectrometry, also known as Fourier transform ion cyclotron resonance mass spectrometry. How can you access this wonderful technology? Well, option number one, you go to Bruker, which actually is possible as you can do, and you buy one. So you need about a couple of millions to get one of these machines, and then you need to learn how to use it. Now, I work with this kind of instruments for about 20 years, and sometimes I still feel a beginner. So the learning curve, because these instruments, contrary to other mass spectrometers, they are fully manual, they have control of just about everything. Imagine that you try to drive your car, and you have, for example, to set the temperature of the engine, the current that goes to each of the spark plugs. What is the voltage of your battery? What is the pressure of the tires? What is the stiffness of the springs of your suspension? What kind of brakes? You get the point. You control everything. You get control, of course, also comes with huge responsibility and also huge difficulties. So the best way to do it is to go to a central board. So this is why in 2005 we actually created one of the first networks in Portugal. Others were the magnetic resonance network, the microscopy, and so on. I think about 4 or 5, if I'm not mistaken. So at that time we had about 9 laboratories in the country. And then in 2013 we entered to the Portuguese roadmap of research structures of strategic interest. And of course we are distributed in the country from Madeira, Algarve. So this is the configuration that will go for the next call. Whenever it opens, we'll be ready. So the highest density of instruments is actually, and laboratories is actually in Lisbon. Not surprising, we have some laboratories also in the center of the country, the north, Algarve, and Madeira. Of course, we pulled Madeira close to the continent so to be more accessible. But of course, we have requests from more laboratories to enter the network. And until the call actually opens, we cannot yet tell what is going to be the final configuration. But to give you an idea of what we do, so basically this is from our report, the last report we did in 2017-2020. So the network was responsible for about 600 publications, 60 PhD theses, more than 100 master theses, all this related to mass spectrometry, and 15 patents, not the patent applications, 2 patents, some European only, but quite a few are global. Of course, what we got from FCT and funding was a little bit over 3 million euros, which is not much if you consider that some of these mass spectrometry units all the way up to this value. But again, of course, we got extra 10 million from competitive fund, not only national, but mainly from the outside world. Of course, this money does not allow us to buy instruments, but it's still very comfortable. So in the next call, we are planning to bid maybe for 10 million and then get maybe 30 competitive. This may seem much, but for example, our similar organization in England is actually negotiating with the government more than 100 billion pounds for mass spectrometry only. So because it's a highly relevant technique and is transversal. For example, not all these laboratories work in structural biology, actually very few work in structural biology. So we cover most areas of mass spectrometry and most of its applications, proteomics, metabolomics, fundamental studies, gas-phase chemistry, radioactive material, chemical, biological, and radioactive defense, something I suspect is going to be very important in the near future. So it's very critical that we provide all these combined resources to this kind of strategic applications. So how do you access this book? You go to our website, you submit a request for access, you describe what you want to do in a very simple form. And then, of course, you access this from one of the nodes. Each node has their own specific conditions, and to maximize access, we have a central access point, but you can also go straight to each and every node. So we are very flexible. It could be collaboration, it could be supported by a joint grant, or it could be a service for a fee. So this is how we operate, and this is how we are in operation since 2005, and we hope to go all the way to beyond 2022. Second option, if you want specifically to apply magnetic resonance mass spectrometry, now there are about 200 of these instruments in the entire world, which means that probably we have less magnetic resonance mass spectrometers than we have cryo-EM instruments. So a group of researchers in Europe decided to create a network. This network basically has several missions, among them to build a community of users, of trained users. So we run training programs, schools, specialized courses, and so on. We have also transnational joint research actions between the different nodes. Technology development, so we work very closely with the group. Is a partner, is not a member of the consortium, but it is a partner. It's a sole manufacturer present as this kind of instrument. So they work very closely with us. For example, the new cell that some of the instruments use was actually invented here at Skoltek in Moscow. So this is one of the laboratories that is very much involved in instrument development. We are more into ion source development together with Prague and others. So in this case, we also have something called transnational access, which means that if you want to do something in one of these instruments, it's very simple. Again, you go to our website and you fill a very simple project. You have 500 words to tell us why do you need access to magnetic resonance mass spectrometry. Then your project, your proposal is evaluated independently, and in 2 weeks you have an answer. If you are granted the possibility of accessing one of our centers, then all the expenses are covered by us. It's completely free. You do your work, and of course the results are also yours to publish without any strings attached. Or you do it collaborative if you want, but if it's not collaborative, the results are yours. The IP is also yours. Everything is yours. So this is the access that we have implemented now. Third possibility of access through Instruct. Actually, Instruct has two centers, one in Finland and the other in the Czech, in Czechia, where you actually have access to this type of instruments. This one is very much focused in native mass spectrometry and other applications, as we saw in the morning. This one here is a little bit more diversified and goes to surface mapping and cross-linking. You can see that this one is Lisbon. So these two are centers, and to access this, you can go through the normal Instruct procedures. To access this one, since we are an Instruct research site, we can offer is pilot access or access through Portuguese Mass Spectrometry Network or through the European Consortium Network. So in the end, for the end user, is how the expenses are going to be covered. If you go through the European project, we cover this. If you go to Instruct, I think we still have to figure it out, the solution. If you go to the network, most likely you will pay a fee. So you notice that the instruments, they look very similar, but in fact these three instruments are radically different, both in performance and characteristics. Magnet strength is different, but for this kind of technique, magnet strength is important, but it's not that critical. Depends, because resolving power depends on the time of acquisition. So if I'm patient enough to wait, say, double the time of the guy that has double my field, I will reach his resolution. In the end, in the finite lifespan, he will always have more resolution than me, but for a practical reason, we can always play with this. In terms of electronics, this instrument is actually more advanced. This gives us an edge because we use special procedures for the Fourier transform, so we work in the so-called absorption mode, and this allows double resolution. If you want to know more about this kind of technology, I would invite you to come again to Lisbon. This will be for the 14th European Fourier Transform Mass Spectrometry workshop, which will take place here at the Tallinn Theatre, most likely in the first or second week of July. We have postponed this for 2 years, but of course we need to have a lot of people here. For example, the inventor of this technology that is in the Mag Lab in Florida. We also would like to have a lot of Russian friends that are actually very important for the development of this technology. And I'm not sure if they will be able to make it in July. I'm very confident and optimistic as always. And of course I have to thank my team. Without nothing of this would be possible. The instruments would just be sitting alone in a dark room without nothing happening. So this is how the people make the magic. I would say 1/3 of the group is dedicated to the computational parts, machine learning, development, and so on. Of course, we use our own resources, our computers, our own servers, but we are also going to use the Portuguese Foundation for Scientific Computing Resources. It's not possible for us to continue just investing in machines, more nodes, more hard drives, more CPUs. If this national facility exists and we can have access to time, that for us is more than enough. Of course, we are also members of the consortium for top-down procurement. This was actually created in Portugal until we scratched some years ago, and part of the COVID-19 mass spectrometry coalition. Where we have some questions from the community, and we hope to keep using mass spectrometry for this kind of applications. Thank you very much for your attention, and any answers to your questions will be provided later on. Before I leave, mass spectrometry is not the only way to measure mass of a molecule. We can actually shine a little bit of light and maybe something happens. I have a feeling that we are going to see that very next close opportunity to us. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will continue on the field of mass photometry, well, a bit different, but on the weighting molecules with light. So I think this is what Carlos mentioned. So we have the pleasure to have this special guest today. So it's Aquila Dapour from the company Refine.
First, want to thank all of the organizers for this meeting together, and especially thank you to Carlos for allowing me to speak a little bit. So again, my name is Akila. I'm from the company Refine, and we offer the technology mass photometry, which means weighing molecules with light. So we've heard a lot about highly specialized, high-resolution instrumentation here in Portugal. And although Refine mass photometry is not in Portugal yet, we're going to try very hard to get this very simple benchtop mass photometry instrument here in Portugal as well. So just a little bit of overview on my presentation. I'll give a brief introduction to the mass photometry technology if you haven't heard it before, and discuss a little bit about mass photometry applications, including a little tidbit of native mass spec data that we don't talk about, but I think will be applicable here. And then I'll discuss a little bit about what's available in terms of the instruments and et cetera that we have. So just taking a huge step back, what does it even mean to weigh molecules with light? If you can imagine, these cylinders are 3 different molecules, one with low, medium, and high mass, but they have the same size, the same hydrodynamic radii. By just using a laser, we can create a shadow pattern, and this shadow pattern is directly proportional to the mass. So we have a low, medium, high mass, and a low, medium, and high intensity of the shadow pattern. So by quantifying the shadow pattern, we can then translate the shadow to the mass and directly get the mass of the particle that we are trying to investigate. So this is not a completely new invention. You might have heard of interference reflection microscopy. All the way back in the 60s, they were looking, using lasers to measure the mass and size of large cellular structures. So what Refine's invention has actually done is closer to interferometric scattering microscopy, the figure on the right, by getting instead of it being a cell, it's more like a small particle, getting the particle close to the glass or the oil objective, we can decrease the noise and increase the signal all the way down to small particles. And it really Refine's inventions with the software and the hardware have really pioneered this interferometric scattering microscopy technique. So the mass photometer is first and foremost a single particle microscope. So the readout for the instrument is actually what's seen on the left. You can see that this is kind of a roughness of the glass surface, and you can't really see much changing, although there are particles landing on the glass surface. By using a technique called ratiometric imaging, you kind of divide the consecutive frames, and you can see what changes between each of the different frames. So believe it or not, in between the second and the third frame, there's a protein landing. And you could really see that when you divide the consecutive frames. You see that particle landing on the glass. That is a protein providing a signal, providing a shadow pattern, and that is what the instrument is actually quantifying. The particle has not left at the end of those frames. It's actually just become background corrected. So we're ready for the next round of particles to land. The light scattering, as I mentioned, is proportional to the mass. So as we see here, we have we can see a bunch of molecules in solution, a variety of different types, many different molecules as well. As they land on the glass, there is a scattered and reflected light, and the interplay between the incident light, scattered light, and reflected light is actually captured by the instrument. And you can see the mass spectrometry contrast. Each of the particles, this is a lighter one, gives a lighter contrast, and a darker particle gives a heavier contrast. The readout for the instrument is mass photometry or ratiometric contrast versus counts. And as you can see here, there are 3 different particles in the solution, and therefore you see 3 distinct peaks in this histogram. And then the next question is what does ratiometric contrast even mean? How do we translate that into mass? So we do that by measuring proteins of a known mass. You can just measure proteins, let's say an antibody or like PSA or something like that, they already know the mass of, and then you can translate that ratiometric contrast that you get from the instrument all the way to the mass. Essentially, you assign a mass to each ratiometric contrast, and then with the calibration curve, you can also see the quality of your calibration and making sure you're getting as low error as possible. So we are a very well-established way of measuring mass, but maybe not as famous as some of these other techniques. So this is just a comparison between mass photometry and many of these other techniques that we have seen also in the past and today. Measuring alpha-B crystalline, which is a polydispersed protein, goes all the way from 200 kilodaltons to 1,000 kilodaltons, depending on the number of subunits. And you can see that mass photometry, which is in light blue, is very comparable to many of the other techniques out there. For example, native MS, SECMALS, and SEM, in terms of that there's no bias for small or larger molecules, and it's very translatable between these different techniques. So some of just the features and benefits of mass photometry, you can actually measure proteins in its native form. So I think maybe some of the benefits compared to some of the other techniques is that it's label-free in solution, and you can use a variety of different buffers. You don't need to wash your sample 60 times, as I've heard before. You get data on all molecules, so every single molecule in the population of the sample, so it's a single molecule counting. You see even rare events, and you have a very wide dynamic range from 30 kilodaltons to over 5 megadaltons as well. And then what's also great is that it's very simple. So you only need a couple of nanomolars of the solution, a couple of microliters, and in literally 2 minutes you will get the mass of your sample of interest. Then, of course, it's also versatile. As you can imagine, if mass is your readout, you can use the mass spectrometer for your applications. And then also a variety of different biomolecules. So we talked a lot about proteins, but something that might be problematic with other techniques would be heterogeneity in terms of glycosylation or membrane proteins. And then we can also use other biomolecules like DNA and lipids as well. We're not limited to just proteins. And just a couple of the different applications that we have published in with mass spectrometry. So quality, so you can see the purity of your sample, for example, the structure of your protein or complex, oligomerization state, do you have your complex or not, before going on to more complex analyses. And then the function of proteins, for example, interactions between two types of proteins. And then also, we are a relatively young company, so we are always looking for collaborations and further development of our techniques, so you could be part of our future. And an example is just like a little bit of medium mass spec data that I will talk about at the end. So just very quickly, quality control, you can evaluate the purification process. This is data that was done in collaboration with the WISE Institute. And this is the RAT20S proteasome, and we are just evaluating different stages of purification. You can see in the very beginning, the RAT proteasome, which is supposed to be at around 700 kilodaltons, the molar ratio is very low. However, as you continue on with the purification, the molar ratio gets higher and higher. And they actually found that at the 5th purification, the molar ratio decreased, so they decided to stop purifying at the 4th step. So it's very useful to see how each of the purification steps relates to their data. You can also use mass spectrometry to see the stability of your complex formation. So these are ribosomes. We're comparing ribosomes in a buffer without magnesium, which does not promote binding the full complex of the ribosome, versus the ribosome with a buffer that includes magnesium. So you can see that with the buffer with magnesium, you get the fully assembled ribosome, but with the buffer without magnesium, you do not get the ribosome. So it's very useful to see the stability of the complex. Next, you can also use mass spectrometry as a precursor, for example, screening different techniques, screening different samples before moving on to another technique. So this is APC, anaphase promoting complex. obviously a very complicated protein. And before moving on to cryo-EM, the authors compared many different samples with mass spectrometry versus NSEM. You can see the ones that have the fully formed complex right in the middle. Mass spectrometry and NSEM ran very similarly. So it's a very complementary technique to many of these ones before moving on to something like cryo-EM, making sure you have the structure of the complex that you are actually looking for. And then in function, we can see antibody-antigen binding or protein-protein interactions. So this is an antibody 2G12 and its antigen. So first we're running the antigen by itself, then we're running the antibody. You can see the monomer and the dimer very clearly. And then you can see the antibody-antigen combination together. You can see the monomer of the antibody plus the antigen, the dimer of the antibody plus the antigen. And actually, if you look at the ratio between the monomer binding and the dimer binding, you can tell that the dimer, it seems to indicate that the dimer has a little bit more higher interaction compared to the monomer when you compare the ratio between the two binding techniques. So you can really also get at the function of certain interactions as well. So this is just a little bit of native mass spec data that we got from Professor Joseph Benish, who's a collaborator with Fine. So I really know nothing about mass spec, so I'm sure you'll know a little bit more about this. But this is a spectra of HSP protein, which is shock protein. It is very heterogeneous, as in there are many different oligomerization states. And they did something called distribution reconstruction, which I don't know anything about, but it looks very complicated to me. But they eventually got to a very nice clean spectra of this HSP protein. However, when they compared the native mass spec data that they got with mass photometry, they actually measured the same HSP proteins on mass photometry as well. You can see that it's very complementary. So the HSP proteins in mass spec is the darker lines, of course, and then the lighter lines as well as the mass photometry data. You can see that they overlay quite well with each other. And the mass spec data is, of course, extremely useful to get down to very high resolution. However, if you want a little bit of a quicker 1 minute of analysis, 1 minute of measuring, 1 minute of analysis, you can use the mass photometer to get similar enough data. That's very comparable. So just a couple of specifications for the mass spec, the mass photometry instrument. Our mass range is 30 kilodaltons to 5 megadaltons, and you can see actually above 5 megadaltons as well. We have a very good resolution between our mass range of 30 kilodaltons to 5 megadaltons, and a slightly higher area above. And then our concentration range is literally in the nanomolar range, so we need very little amount of sample in order to get mass data. And then just a little bit about our new releases this year. So I've talked about most of our data was in the 2MP instrument, or Fine 2MP. We also have an automation add-on that you can add to our instrument, and you can get a walk-away of 14 measurements in 1 hour. And you can add it on to current instruments and buy it separately as well. We also have consumables to make it very simple and efficient to use all of your mass spectrometry needs. And then we also, I don't know how useful it would be for this crowd, but we have an instrument specific to full and empty AAV measurements called SAMXMP. So feel free to let us know if that's something of interest as well. So I think we're doing questions later, but if anyone has something super pressing, feel free to shout out. But these are our email addresses. My colleague Akila and my colleague Perla is here as well. We'll be around, so please feel free to chat with us if you have any questions, or if you'd like to demo the 2MP instrument, we can certainly arrange that. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Akila. So from what my knowledge, I think this technique has been introduced to Instruct as a platform, also with in the UK, right? exactly, this is the name, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So we will go to our final talk, and which is also about one Portuguese infrastructure. So this time is the PT-NMR and structural biology and the recent contributions. So we'll have the pleasure to listen to Eurico Cabrita from FCT. So thanks.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the organization, for inviting me here for this PCISBIO Day. It's now becoming the day where the structural biology community in Portugal is together, and I think we have to do a special thanks to Maria Albania. So me and Carlos, we are in this since the beginning, and it's the personal effort of Maria Albania that has allowed us to be here, and also a thank to Susan, because Susan has always been very supportive of our participation in Instruct, and so it was that's continuous all since the beginning. So I think we have to thank Susan because it's our last meeting, as she told us. We were very happy to be with her all these years and to work with her. So I'm just going to do a small highlight of what we have been doing in the NMR. So the NMR is just like the mass spectrometry. We are here since 2005, and so we grow a lot. And in this last call from FCT, we are now in all the country. So from the north to the south, and also including Madeira. So now we have joined Évora and the Algarve, and also in Lisbon. Also, all the academic institutions in the country are now represented in the NMR network. So all the NMR machines are together in this network. So it's a large network with a lot of equipment. We have also a big investment in equipment in the last 10 years. From this 50 million euros, about 6 million are from the FCT, from the roadmap, and the other money is from other tenders and from competitive tenders, European and also national. A lot is centered in Lisbon, but in the last roadmap, and as we heard today, this will change, because the money that comes from the roadmap is for the infrastructure money, and this has a problem, is that we will not be able to do big investments in Lisbon anymore. We have to do it outside Lisbon, because 80% of this money that we received of the funds will be from the regions, for sure, if they have the same kind of funding scheme as before. So I think we will see more machines and more development outside of Lisbon in the future. This was already what happened in this last call, and so what we give is access to modern NMR equipment, mainly routine analysis for academia and companies. So since we have all the NMR machines in the country, the network, as you can imagine, most of the routine analytical service of universities is done within the equipments of the network. Of course, also a lot of support to research projects, training, support of NMR teaching activities. So we support all the courses at bachelor's degrees and at master degrees, and of course PhD programs. And then a part of our work is also with companies, and of course the integration with research infrastructures. Just a number that reflects more than 200 scientific publications per year are directly supported by the network. When it comes to the services that the network provides, so we have a kind of a smart specialization strategy. So not all the machines, they are all MRs, but not all the machines do exactly the same. So mainly we have three big fields of research: structural biology, material sciences, and small molecules. And then we have some centers that are specialized either in microimaging, metabolomics, or even in vivo NMR. So we try to have a complementary and specialized research and development oriented in different centers. And in terms of structural biology, so in the last 5 years, so these are the centers that mainly have the machines with the capabilities of doing research in the structural biology field. So here in Lisbon, ITQB and FCT. And then we have in Coimbra, Aveiro, Porto, and over there. And so all these machines, they existed, and then in this last period of funding, what we aimed was to increase the sensitivity of the installed spectrometers for structural biology. So we invested money in a helium cryoprobe for the 800 megahertz at ETQB. This gives us a 3.5 increase in sensitivity. So sensitivity, as most of you know, is really the problem with the NMR technique as compared to the other techniques that we have with so here. So sensitivity is a problem, and we try to boost it as much as possible. So the cryoprobe technology is what you need to, in order to, if you don't increase your megahertz, so the other what you can do is to have this cryoprobe technology. The machines are extremely expensive now. If you go beyond 800 megahertz, so you will need more than 4 or 5 million euros to buy a new spectrometer. I think this will not be possible in Portugal for the next year, so we really have to increase sensitivity, not by increasing the megahertz, but by recurring to this technology. So we also installed cryoprobes in the 500 megahertz machines at UKB and FCT Nova. This gives us a 2.5 increase in sensitivity. And we also installed a helium cryoprobe and a new console in Coimbra for the 600 megahertz. This was just now installed at the end of the year. So it's becoming operational. So this is what you really, so the centers that are more prepared for structural biology in Portugal, the access, as Carlos also said, it's a centralized access. You go to our page and you just request access. It's a very simple process, or you go directly to one of the nodes and you request access. Since we are not funded anymore for time of users, so you have to pay a fee that is related with the costs of the consumables that are mainly the cryogens. I wanted to give you a little bit of flavor of what we are doing in terms of research and what we are supporting in the network. And so I chose 2 examples of 2 success stories of what the community in Portugal is doing in structural biology. And for this, I just went to see who were the major users of the NMR in structural biology in the last 5 years in our infrastructure. And so I came with these 2 groups. One group that works with NMR related to bioremediation and bioenergy, and the other group that works with NMR in glycosciences. And what is interesting is that it's not only supporting research projects, but it's also supporting research careers. So the infrastructure goes much beyond the support of a research project, of a paper. Sometimes you really need an infrastructure for a researcher to establish himself or herself as an independent group. And you will see that in these cases, this infrastructure was fundamental to attract people and to establish young people as independent researchers. So in the first case that I want to show you is from the group of Carlos at FCT Nova. And this is the biochemistry of bioenergetics in proteins. And so they studied the respiratory chain of heterogenic bacteria. So this is an old research topic in Portugal that Carlos was former in ITQB, and in ITQB this study was started by the founder of ITQB. So it's something that has a lot of tradition in Portugal. So Carlos studies the oxidative metabolism that is from this microorganisms that is coupled to the reduction of extracellular electron acceptors, and it can be used for since it can be used for remediation, since this can be coupled to metals, or even it can be used in mechanical fuel cells because it can generate electricity. And is using the NMR not only to solve the structures of all these cytochromes of this bacteria, but also to characterize functionally and thermodynamically how these multi-use cytochromes work. So it developed based on the paramagnetic properties properties of the iron and of the heme. He devised a protocol that allows him to calculate the structures, but also to characterize it, because this is extremely complicated when you have multiple beams and electron transfer that occurs here. So he established a way, just based in NMR, to study the functionality of all of these beams, and this is quite interesting. So he works a lot. He does a lot of titration, so that's why he is one of the main users in our infrastructure, because this is all this work takes a long time, and there are a lot of organisms that we have studied. They published very recently a review in antioxidants, so if you want to know more about this, and they have published more than 20 papers on NMR related in this subject in the last 5 years. And as I told you, this has been fundamental. Just recently, the Leonor that she's a young researcher working in the group, she just got one of these very difficult, very hard research contracts to get in Portugal, and with this redox-based project, and she's now an assistant researcher with this contract. And of course, the infrastructure was fundamental because most of the research is based on the NMR study of these systems. So the other example that I want to show is again of a younger researcher, Philippa Marcel. She's from the Biochemistry Research and Literature by NMR group, and she's also a young researcher. So she was a investigador FCT in 2017, and she got an assistant researcher contract also under the same program in 2021. And again, it's an example of someone that really uses the different structure, and in this case, it's to combine NMR-based approaches with molecular modeling protocols to uncover capable mechanisms of protein recognition. So she's managed to study protein glycosylation and in projects that are related with cancer, and the major goal is to design innovative protein-based cancer therapies. So Philippa also uses NMR heavily, and she, just to give you an example of the work that she's been developing, showing in this case these are mucins that are proteins that are overexpressed in cancer cells, and the aberrant glycosylation in cancer is something that she's interested in, and for this she devises a method just based in NMR to study how these proteins, how these glucoside transferases, how they glucosate these mucins. And so with the proteins and with an engineered derivative of mucins, she devised an NMR protocol to follow all the steps of the glucosylation and to check how this naked protein becomes glucosylated and how one glucosylation position then leads the next glucosylation, and so far. So this is really a great work that was just published in JAX very recently, and this is just to give you an idea of the kind of use that is being done in the infrastructure. So another aspect of the infrastructure that now related with COVID. So just to show you that because we have this infrastructure, because we have this modern equipment, we could join the NMR and COVID initiative. So this initiative was launched by the NMR community or applied for all the researchers to join efforts in studying the proteins of COVID, of SARS-CoV-2. And in this work, they studied the glucosylation of the spike protein, and they showed how this glucosylation was important in order for this spike protein to interact with human lectins. And this was a very important event. And these are the two examples that I want to show you. I had a very brief presentation just to show how this is impacting not only the science but also the careers of the people. So it's really important that the research infrastructures continue, and finally we just hope that FCT has this income for the next program that will be in the summer. And yeah, so thank you very much. That was all.
Thanks a lot, Enrico. So I invite the speakers of this session, so Paulo, Carlos, and Aquila, to join here, so we have our time to discuss the different infrastructures and also if anyone has questions regarding the work of Aquila. So please be free, just ask any questions if you want. There is, oh yeah, there's that.
My question on curiosity is for Akil. Does the method that you're proposing, the technique, can cope with proteins that are not global and either fast interconverting between different oligomeric states, for instance?
Yeah, so mass spectrometry is size and shape independent. So no matter the shape of the protein or whatever particle, but yeah, protein, if it's globular versus filament versus disarrayed or anything like that, it'll still show up as the same ratiometric contrast spot depending on the mass. Does that answer your question?
My question is to Paulo. So we all know how expensive the equipment are, but also the maintenance. So now for the talos, for the new microscope, the 200 kV that is arriving or that arrived. So is there already budget planned for the maintenance? And how is the access to the microscope, the scientific community, how is it going to be done? I'm sure there's already a plan.
Thanks for the question. I didn't read anything there because I know that I knew the question would come. But typically the service contract is 5% of the cost. So we are talking about 100,000 euros a year. So that's a typical thing. Plus, of course, the facility manager. So we have actually done, I think it was actually mandatory in the business plan for 15 years. And so the way it's going to operate, we have already more or less some numbers, so there's going to be a fee per hour. And so what we did is just that business plan for 15 years to make sure that, of course, we don't have any loss or any income because we are not making income. So the numbers are, I mean, it's maybe going to be adjusted at around 40 euros per hour, something like that. We need to check the details yet. And so this is the way it's going to be operating. So you will have access. There will be two ways of access. Access is the same as the other microscope. They are completely open. But there are two ways. Either you provide samples. You have facility managers that can do the whole work with reports. Or if you want to get trained, you get trained, and then you have you will use the instrument. The advantage, of course, is just you don't pay the operation of the facility manager. So of course it's much cheaper if you use it on your own. So we encourage that, but of course some groups they just want the work done, and that's fine. But so this was, I think, is a critical question because I mean the capital of the instrument is just, just part of it. The service contract is very important, and if you think from an administration point of view, it's critical because we are paying 100,000 for every year. I have to say though that we did really a good deal with Thermo Fisher, and they gave us actually almost 6 years of warranty. So we don't have to pay for several years, so we can accrue fees to make sure that the fees low. Otherwise, these things run at 100 euros an hour or something like that. They become very expensive.
Any other questions from the public? If not, so I have one for, so in terms of the mass spectrometry, it's like, so since you are a site of Instruct, like how do you, how is how is the role then based on the site of being a site in the Instruct, and since you have a really good spectrometrist to have access, so you will be giving training, you will have access, so how does it work?
So, as a research site, our main focus is training, dissemination, of course training the national community, also the country, more structure. Of course, we have some technologies that are unique. This is one of the cases. So we are already offering European projects and also to the national network. But research sites have the possibility to offer access to private access. This is something that is, I would say, under discussion on the terms on how, whether the funding will come from Instruct or we share, which I think is the most convenient way to do it. And then we will see. We have experience in granting access to technology. But the purpose of the research site is also to take advantage of the fact that we have a very enthusiastic, very high quality that is working in structural biology for years. It has a very international projection. It has always been supporting the Instruct. It has also received an amazing support from Instruct. And because Instruct is not something, I would say, abstract, I would dare say that our galactic light has been seasoned and the team throughout all these years. Of course, there is a new light that will shine also. I see a spark somewhere. So we will not be left in the dark. But as a research site, our main mission is actually to provide training and to project the knowledge we have. But of course, since we have technology, we plan to offer private access, and in our program for the future, we plan to be on the full-fledged Instruct research. That is our ambition, and for that we have our plans. But I will not describe at this moment, not because they are secret, but possibly because it will take some 5-10 minutes, which I think it's not the moment here. But if we have ideas, we have plans, and we want to do it. The site is under our responsibility. And of course, our participation in Instruct has always had from the beginning the support of the two networks, our Spectrometry network and the university's network. And of course, I have to say a word for the which is the face, the body, the heart and soul of structural biology in spearheading all this effort. Because this takes time, this requires dedication. This requires a lot of effort. It's not easy. It's easy to say that this is expensive. We don't have money. Completely irrelevant. When we start working, when we get a position at the university, what do we get? In my case, I got half a laboratory, 25 square meters. Okay, there were benches, and half an office. This is what we have. Then what we do? Try to get money. Apply, try, fail, try again. It's not like the other guy wants to say, fail again, fail better. No, don't fail again. Succeed better every time. And then you end up, you look back and you see that you do something. You're part of something. And this is time, effort, dedication, and of course, people that believe in the effort that we have.
So is there any final question, or so I think we will close this part of the discussion, and this is we had a really nice day. I mean, we have been in Zoom meetings for so times, so it felt really nice to have really nice talks. So to close the session, so first I would like to thank again to all the speakers of this session. And then just to finalize the meeting, then the concluding remarks will be done by.
And we have been able to speak with masses here. Anyway, obviously I'm not going to take much time because we are all tired, but I cannot finish without thanking all the presence here, all those who kept up to now, because as I said at the beginning, it is the meeting where we had the highest number of participants. And I'd like to especially thank the colleagues from the Instruct centers that came, because as you all know, we have no special funds for this, so they came on their own funds, which is very, very nice. It has always been like that since the beginning of the PCISBIO meetings. So because we didn't succeed with the whole map, and therefore we have no special project. Nevertheless, we have been able to gather the Portuguese community, and I think this is very important, and I'm very happy to see that the momentum is going through, and we are really with a strong community in relation to the size of our community that is using Instruct. And I think this is very important, and I'm sure it will continue as strong as up to now and even better. Finally, I cannot finish without asking for a big applause to Susan. Susan was our inspiring person from the hub since the beginning, our support, and is a truly good friend of mine. And I will really miss her. Anyway,